First, I have to add my congratulations to Robin and to Nilda and to the faculty and the trainees and all the community partners that have made these last 25 years so successful. I am sure that all of the innovations and foundation and transformations created over these last 25 years means that the next 25 years are going to be amazing. So congratulations, Robin and Nilda. It's wonderful to share the celebration with you. So I've been asked to lay the groundwork for essentially the research foundation for today's talks and discussions. I'm going to start by talking about how we at the Children in Nature Network think about the areas of children's development that are affected by nature. I'll talk a little bit about the types of settings and forms of nature engagement that lead to those outcomes, and I'll talk about the mechanisms that we think are responsible for nature's impact. I'm going to then talk a little bit about the state of nature connectedness. Spoiler alert, it's been going down over time. And I'm going to talk about why we need to think about that disconnection and its reversal from a population and a systems level. And finally, I'll offer a set of recommendations to reverse the nature disconnection trend for the benefit of humans and the planet by creating nature-rich settings where kids live, learn, and play, and nature-rich experiences with the people that matter most in those kids' lives, their parents and their educators. The research around kids in nature falls into 4 big buckets: improved physical health, improved mental health, enhanced cognitive function and relatedly educational outcomes or better academic performance, and finally, pro-environmental attitudes and behaviors and action. At Children in Nature Network, we have this mantra. We say that nature helps kids be healthier, happier, smarter, and better stewards of the environment. I'm going to tell you about what we believe are the most robust research findings based on a literature review that my team at CNN did last summer in 2024. You'll notice that sometimes I will be specific about the setting or the type of nature engagement, greenery around the home, or garden-based programs, for example. That's because not all natural settings or forms of nature engagement lead to the same outcomes. We have to be specific sometimes. When an outcome is found across a variety of settings or forms of engagement, I'll be more vague or inclusive in my language. I'll also be careful to use language like may promote when we don't yet have experimental studies that would allow us to say nature caused some outcome. We only know that more nature is associated with more of a positive outcome or less of a negative outcome. Okay, so let's dive in. So research shows that children are healthier when they live, learn, and play in and around nature. And that starts before birth. Mothers living in green neighborhoods, especially moms from less advantaged backgrounds, tend to have healthier newborns in terms of full-term babies with healthy birth weights. Then when those children live in greener environments, greener neighborhoods, they may have greater physical activity, which promotes healthier weight and enhanced immune function through microbiotic health, which is through getting your hands dirty, basically, getting your hands into the microbes. You know, you probably heard when you were a kid, don't get dirty. Well, sometimes parents are wrong, and we now know that actually getting dirty is a good thing as long as there isn't lead or arsenic or something like that in that dirt. You may have heard about the myopia effect. When children spend time outdoors in the presence of sunlight, they may have reduced risk for or reduced progression of nearsightedness. This is because sunlight helps regulate dopamine during development, and dopamine is responsible in part for the shape of the eyeball. And when you don't have dopamine functioning appropriately due to an absence of sunlight, the eyeball can kind of elongate, and that is what causes nearsightedness. There's also some, truth to when you're indoors and you're looking at a screen, you're sort of training your eyes to see, the 18 inches in front of you and not off into the horizon. But that sunlight piece is actually quite important. The dopamine effect is quite important. So, as opposed to these passive forms of nature exposure, active engagement through play and learning in natural environments tends to promote motor skills as well as increase in physical activity and decrease in sedentary time, which is beneficial for a variety of health outcomes in childhood and as those kids develop into adulthood, such as reduced risk for chronic illnesses related to adult obesity, diabetes, hypertension, etc. Healthy weight and improved nutrition may be fostered specifically by school gardening programs, particularly when those programs directly include nutrition education and food prep and fruit and vegetable tasting as part of the garden-focused activities. And importantly, it's often the children from disadvantaged backgrounds who benefit more from nature than their relatively more advantaged peers. That is a statistical effect that's called the equigenic effect, and it may help reduce health disparities. Research also shows that living in greener environments and engaging with nature and companion animals as well improves children's mental health and their emotional well-being. Here again, both passive exposure and active engagement can improve mental health. Nearby nature bolsters children's resilience in the face of adversity. Kids tend to engage in more frequent positive social interactions and in constructive and associative and cooperative play in natural environments more so than they do in built environments. When kids just live in greener environments, they tend to have more positive moods, their stress is lower, they have more positive social interactions. So those are examples of passive exposure. Active engagement with nature through learning and play also reduces stress and anxiety in children and youth, and it may contribute to positive outcomes not only in childhood, but mental health outcomes throughout adulthood as well. For example, learning and playing on green schoolyards can promote the social and emotional well-being of kids. Things like nature-based wilderness programs could promote a range of social emotional skills and build resilience and agency. And finally, nature-based interventions can promote well-being of children with special needs, including kids with ADHD. Nature helps essentially reduce ADHD symptoms, sometimes so significantly it's almost like taking a dose of Ritalin. It can be that powerful. So regarding smarter, nature improves academic performance by enhancing the cognitive functions, the physical and mental health, and the social emotional development that support learning. I'm going to talk for a minute about nature-based learning, or NBL. By NBL, I'm referring to learning outdoors in a variety of subject areas, meaningfully using the natural environment as the context for learning, and natural objects and phenomena as the tools for instruction. It's more in and with and through nature than it is necessarily about nature. It can take place in formal schooling. It can be the how formal schooling happens, whether that be primary or secondary or early childhood. It can also take place in informal settings. In many studies, nature-based learning outperforms traditional classroom-based learning. And when it only matches or seems equivalent to classroom-based learning, the fact that it also has health and mental health and socio-emotional benefits really argues for its relative value and superiority over classroom-based or traditional educational approaches. The research suggests that the outcomes of nature-based learning, academic outcomes, may be related to both simple exposure to nature itself, as well as the characteristics of nature-based instruction, or the pedagogy. So with respect to that exposure, just being around nature or seeing nature enhances attention and self-regulation and decreases stress. And there are two theories that align with these research findings and help explain them. One is called the attention restoration theory, or ART. And ART suggests that we have two systems of attention in the brain. We have effortful, directed, voluntary attention that we have to use when we are focused on work or kids are focused on studying or paying attention in the classroom. And we have another system that is involuntary and effortless. It's when something just sort of captures our fascination and we just kind of drift off and look at that or hear that or process that other thing. When we are focused and working hard, that directed attention system gets tired. When we go out into nature and that effortless, involuntary system kicks in and pulls us to look at the clouds, to look at the wind blowing the leaves, it gives that directed attention system a chance to rest. So that when you come back to that effortful task in the classroom, for example, your directed attention system is restored, and you can focus better. The other theory is called the stress reduction theory, and the idea here is that, stressful events get under our skin. They kick in the sympathetic nervous system, that fight or flight system. Our palms sweat, our breath quickens, our respiration and pulse go up, our blood pressure goes up, our cortisol reacts with a surge of cortisol that helps us, get prepared for that fight or flight. Nature tampers that down. Our blood pressure goes down, our cortisol recovers quickly, our palms start sweating, we can breathe normally, etc. At school, that passive exposure to nature looks like greenery around the school, green views from the classroom, green walls in the school hallways or in the classrooms. And this kind of nature exposure can support academic success and the functions important for learning. These include cognitive functions like attention and memory and self-regulation, emotional functions such as stress regulation, emotional regulation and well-being, and social functions such as pro-social behavior or cooperation. These important outcomes are related to educational performance because kids just learn better when they are paying attention, when they're not feeling super stressed, when they're cooperating with each other, when they're better regulated. Similarly, active learning in nature through nature-based learning or nature-based instruction or pedagogy supports academic success and the functions important for learning. These include motivation and engagement in addition to those same cognitive functions of attention and working memory and self-regulation, the emotional functions of stress regulation, emotional regulation and well-being, and that pro-social behavior. This is partly because of the simple exposure to nature like we just talked about, but it's also because teaching in nature lends itself particularly well to high-impact pedagogical approaches. It's just easy to do inquiry-based learning, investigations, phenomenon-based learning, social, collaborative, active, hands-on, that kind of high-impact teaching approach. It just comes out in nature very readily. So these teaching approaches increase student engagement and motivation, which enhances students' capacity to learn. And then the whole class is affected as a unit as well. When each child is reaping the benefits of nature on, for example, their self-regulation or their motivation and engagement, the combination of all of those individual self-regulated, motivated kids is that they create a regulated, motivated class, and then everybody is in a position to learn better. A note about gardens specifically. Earlier I mentioned that school gardens can promote healthier weight. Well, garden-based learning can also promote nutrition-related knowledge, clearly, but also academic success. Gardens are great places to teach interdisciplinarily across subjects like math and science. Can even bring in art and social studies and math and science, all together through garden-based experiences. Lastly, and importantly, greening around schools and nature-based instruction can support students with special needs. I mentioned before, greener environments and time in nature may enhance children's attention skills and reduce symptoms of ADHD, just as an example. Another example, kids on the autism spectrum tend to be more verbal and better regulated when they're learning and playing outdoors. And for kids with disadvantaged family backgrounds, greening around schools and nature-based learning can play a particularly helpful role. Earlier, I talked about the echogenic effect, this idea that nature is statistically relatively more impactful for kids from disadvantaged backgrounds than those from advantaged backgrounds. That effect may also be present for educational outcomes. It's not quite as well researched or not as consistently found in the education literature as it is in the health literature, but it's probably there. And finally, research shows that spending time in nature creates nature champions. Time spent in nature as a child, particularly in activities or places that evoke an emotional connection, can foster care and concern for the natural world and wildlife and even empathy for other humans. Environmental educators used to think, if we just tell them what the problems are and what the solutions are, they'll know what to do. They'll grow up to be environmental stewards. And we now know it's not that easy. It's more complicated. It's not just about explicitly teaching about nature. Childhood experiences that emotionally connect kids to nature and enhance positive attitudes towards the environment, which underlie the development of an environmental identity, these attitudes make kids more open to learning about environmental problems and solutions. And it's that combination of emotional connection, pro-environmental attitudes, that sense of identity, I am a nature person, combined with environmental knowledge, that then results in taking actions that demonstrate care for the earth. Both free play in nature and time spent with a caring adult are the most important experiences that facilitate that connection. These factors imply opportunities for nature engagement in kids' everyday lives and within their family lives. These are examples of tacit learning that builds deep personal connection to nature and an ethic of care and can lead to more sustained behavior. Building environmental literacy directly through environmental education or, for example, something like field trips to environmental learning centers, these can also be supportive by providing necessary frameworks and tools to translate those personal ethics into effective action, but it's really that emotional connection or bond that is the foundation of it all. I should mention that the more connected children feel to nature, the higher their sense of well-being. So just remember that mantra. Nature helps kids be healthier, happier, smarter, and better stewards of the environment. One thing you may have noticed is that all these domains intersect with each other. Physical and mental health can affect each other, and they can both affect, either individually or synergistically, learning and academic outcomes. Connection to nature enhances emotional well-being as well as stewardship behavior. So it's all part of, an interconnected web. What I've talked about so far has been at the individual level and more of a short-term outlook, sort of within childhood or within an individual lifespan. But over time, generation to generation, fewer and fewer people have contact with nature, especially children. 30 years ago, Bob Pyle coined the term extinction of experience, which just means there's been a loss of interaction with nature over time. We've mostly attributed that to development and environmental degradation and sort of the modern lifestyle of being indoors, connected to screens. But I'm going to talk more in a minute about how that's only part of the story. When this loss of connection to nature happens in these successive generations, it's called generational amnesia. Each generation thinks that what they're experiencing or not experiencing by way of nature is just normal, because they don't have memory and nothing to compare it to of what prior generations experienced. This is also called the shifted baseline effect. Normal just seems like it goes down over time, and you just don't know that it's going down over time. The baseline is shifting. So when this happens at the population level, generation over generation, the effects for humans and the planet can be devastating. Some impacts are a deterioration in public health in the form of physical and mental well-being declines, and then reduced emotional affinity for nature, which has implications for both human well-being and the pro-environmental attitudes and behaviors that are critical for protecting biodiversity and addressing climate change. Basically, a cycle of apathy takes over. And in systems thinking terms, this is kind of a classic feedback loop. We've known for a while that connection to nature sort of takes a dip in adolescence. In the past, we've thought that it rebounds in young adulthood, and all is well. But there's a real risk, which may already actually be happening, that as teens spend more and more time on devices and in social media, habits that persist into adulthood, their connection to nature won't rebound. And that disconnection from nature will be maintained throughout their adult life. When they go on to be parents, making sure that their children have rich, nature-based experiences is likely to be of lower priority. This is called intergenerational transmission of disconnection from nature. In fact, this intergenerational transmission was found by Miles Richardson to be the primary or dominant factor driving disconnection from nature from 1800 to 2020. Richardson modeled nature connection based on nature words used in literature and other sort of cultural products, and looked at how historic urbanization data and opportunities to engage with nature and intergenerational transmission have shaped connection to nature over time. The model showed that there's been this marked decline in connection to nature. You see that big line going downhill. And intergenerational transmission was the primary driver of that decline. He also modeled into the future to 2125, essentially 100 years at this point, as this graph shows, and demonstrated that truly transformational interventions starting now, or actually 2020, and sustained until 2050, eventually reverse that decline in nature connectedness, starting at about 2050. And after 2050, these transformational changes trigger a self-sustaining recovery in nature connection. You see that kind of popping back up again. By transformational, we're talking about a combined strategy of environmental restoration to the tune of 1,000% increase in nature access, plus strengthened intergenerational transmission through significant investment in school-based and parent-focused intervention that results in a 30% gain in child connectedness rather than the typical 10% gain in child nature connectedness that you see with kind of typical single interventions. That's what it takes to create a synergistic effect that eventually leads to a substantial and self-sustaining increase in nature connectedness. That sounds pretty daunting, right? 1,000% and triple, the impact on nature connectedness of interventions. But when something happens as part of a system, it's got multiple causes or contributors, and that can be a tremendous opportunity. It means that multiple actors in the system can play a role in making a change. And from what we saw in the Richardson study, it's going to take multiple actors using various approaches in different levels of the system across multiple sectors, basically all hands, to make the change. This circles of influence graphic illustrates how various actors can make a contribution and how that contribution can be leveraged when it's done strategically. For example, a child's connectedness to nature, there in the center green circle, is influenced directly by things very proximal to them, such as their schoolyard or their teacher, or certainly their parents, as we saw with intergenerational transmission. Kids' connection to nature can also be influenced by more distal, sort of outer rung circles in this diagram, sometimes directly, but often indirectly. For example, look at policy, or for that matter, funding of public spaces or the park system. Those park system policies or funding influence nearby public green space, and then that influences kids' connection to nature. Another example might be licensure, which influences teachers, who then go on to play a role in connecting kids to nature through their pedagogical choices. The implication here is that we need a combination of strategies. We need direct programming, formally and informally, with kids and with their parents and kids. We need nature-based learning in schools. We need lots of greening, and we also need funding and policies that incentivize greening and facilitate intensive, effective programming. I found Richardson's discussion of what it will take to achieve that transformational change quite compelling. So I'm going to leave you with a fairly detailed set of recommendations that are grounded in his work, but combined with some of my own thinking, particularly around the idea that given that this is a system, and we got to think, do systems thinking here, there are many actors from different sectors that can both take action as well as be the recipients of action based on where they sit within this circles of influence. So the first recommendation is we have to strengthen intergenerational transmission. The focus here is engaging parents and educators to foster connection and confidence in parents who will influence their kids, and in kids who will then go on to influence their own children when they become adults. So the first recommendation here is teachers need to integrate nature engagement directly into the school curriculum, learning in, with, and through, as well as about nature. Currently, teachers are not particularly prepared to do this kind of instruction. So preparation programs, licensure, professional development programming, all of that is something that is going to need to change and absolutely has to happen in order to support this. Second, cities and school systems can launch large-scale public awareness campaigns to encourage family nature engagement, focusing both on the individual and the familial pathways to connection and on all of the well-being benefits. Third, nonprofits can create peer networks for parents where they can share nature engagement strategies, which promotes kind of this peer-to-peer or cultural transmission of nature connection. They can also offer programs for new parents to boost their confidence in and their comfort in nature that they can then transmit to their new children, their newborns. And finally, family-oriented policies, including funding, can facilitate and integrate nature-engaged family outings, provide parenting resources, emphasizing nature's well-being benefits, and support community-led interventions, particularly in urban environments. The second recommendation is transforming urban greening and access. Here the focus is addressing the decline in nature connection associated with that urbanization and development through intentional design and planning that is transformational. Remember, Richardson said 1,000% increase in access to green. So first, architects, landscape architects, and designers can work with planners to transform city planning to prioritize biodiverse, accessible green spaces, parks, green corridors, green schoolyards, boulevards, pocket parks, et cetera, to maximize nature engagement opportunities. And second, and very relatedly and importantly, city government and planners can integrate nature access across every aspect of the public realm, specifying green space and nature access points across all sectors: education, health, transportation, arts, retail, housing. Basically, everywhere people go or play or live or learn or work, there needs to be nature in meaningful ways. Third, everyone needs to shift their mindset to recognize that current policies are insufficient. A large-scale transformation in the quality and the quantity of urban nature is required if we're going to reverse this cycle and undo that shifted baseline effect. Third recommendation is about implementing adaptive governance. That's sort of wonky sounding, but basically this is about moving beyond policies that are just sort of about supporting the status quo toward flexible and collaborative and innovative governance structures that can support that transformation. So city councils, NGOs, community leaders can form collaborations to co-design large-scale interventions, linking urban planning, education, health sectors, et cetera, to do that work across sectors in an interdisciplinary and transformative sort of way. City government and planning can come together to create incentives for nature-rich real estate developments or community-led rewilding initiatives to stimulate an adaptive response to nature loss. And lastly, all stakeholders can use future-focused planning to model potential nature connectedness trajectories under different policy and greening scenarios to inform their long-term resilient planning outcomes and decision-making. And finally, it's important to monitor and evaluate nature connectedness. The focus here is about embedding long-term, real-time data tracking into policy to enable systemic learning and refinement. First, government officials, researchers, NGOs can expand and make permanent national and local monitoring systems for nature connectedness, like child and parent surveys. Cheryl Charles and I have a colleague, Matteo Giusti, in England, who is working on a model of measuring connection to nature across a continuum from in nature to with nature to for nature to as nature, with as nature being that full integration. We are all part of nature. Second, city staff, educators, healthcare leaders, et cetera, can include nature connectedness metrics in their own sectors, broader well-being, education, health, and environment reporting frameworks for systemic tracking, just integrated into the things we're already measuring, and then track across those various sectors. And finally, timely and accurate data needs to be used as a feedback mechanism to inform and refine interventions, to learn over time, and to identify emerging tipping points, which may tell us that, oh, we're onto something. This might actually create that turnaround effect that we're looking for so that that graph starts going up around nature connectedness. So earlier, I asked you to remember this mantra about nature helps kids be healthier, happier, smarter, and better stewards of the environment. And I want to add a few more words that I want you to remember. Transformative, intergenerational, systemic, and contextual. So transformative policies are needed to break this cycle of disconnection. Those transformative policies or interventions must be integrated and coordinated. Massive urban greening will have limited impact if we're not also doing the family engagement and that intergenerational transmission. This challenge is systemic. This is a complex system with nonlinear dynamics, meaning that the things that go into the system don't necessarily relate directly to what comes out of it. So there can be unpredictability, chaos, unexpected shifts. And in order to guard against that, we need that transformational change rather than iterative or tweaking sorts of changes. Basically, it's belts and suspenders time. But the systemic nature of this change means that there are a lot of ways to intervene, and there are lots of opportunities for people across many sectors and many stakeholder groups to play an important role. And finally, context matters. Interventions must be context sensitive, specifically addressing disparities in access, cultural differences in nature engagement, particularly in underserved communities, and we have to leverage that echogenic effect. So I'm going to stop there and offer you my email address so that if you want to follow up on any of this or learn more about this research or connect about anything at Children in Nature Network, please contact me. I love hearing from people and would be happy to have more conversation.